Hi, everyone. Welcome to our BPS webinar entitled 5 Strategies to Foster School Success. My name is Dr. Jan Hittleman. I'm the Director of Boulder Psychological Services, and I look forward to talking to you today to give you some, I hope, very effective strategies to help you to kind of figure out why your student may not be achieving success in school and, of course, what to do about it. We do have the chat box, as you can see on the side of your screen, and please feel free to sign in. I'm going to try to answer questions as we go, and you can also provide your feedback. Only positive feedback, however. Welcome to our BPS webinar entitled 5 Strategies to Foster School Success. My name is Dr. Jan Hill. Sorry about that feedback. Let's start. During this webinar, here's what we're going to focus on. We're first going to talk about the 5 most common reasons why students underperform academically. And, you know, there are other reasons as well, of course, but in my experience, I've worked many years as a school psychologist and a licensed psychologist, primarily working with children and families. And these are really the most common areas where we see concern in terms of academic performance. And then, very importantly, I'm going to show you how to do a skills analysis of your child's strengths and weaknesses in terms of these different areas, and then we'll be able to develop a really good strategic plan of how to help that student improve and experience more success in school. The 5 areas that we're going to discuss today include the following. The first is learning challenges. Now, this can be a function of one or more learning difficulties in terms of how the student processes information. And in a little while, I'm going to go into a little more detail on each of these categories. And so when we talk in a little while about learning challenges, I'll explain to you some of the more common learning issues that kids experience in school and some strategies as to how we might be able to identify that. Another very important area is emotional factors. If a student is struggling with significant emotional issues, their performance can be dramatically compromised. The other thing that's important about looking at emotional factors is they can look like everything else. In other words, if a child is very anxious, for example, it can look exactly like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And if we have an anxious child, the last thing we want to do is, of course, give them stimulant medication. So this is another reason why we want to really be thoughtful about the etiology or cause of some of these symptoms of concern and really look carefully at emotional factors and either rule them in or rule them out. And we'll talk more about that as well. The other area is behavioral issues, and these are behaviors that are often seen in the classroom. And if they're not geared towards learning, their resulting academic skill acquisition will be impacted, and we'll talk about some of the more common behavioral issues in the classroom as well. Our fourth area is achievement motivation. And this is really of key importance. Earlier in my career, when I worked as a school psychologist, I would do a lot of psychological testing, working with kids that were having problems in school. And one of the things that was most interesting to me is if I tested a child with a really high IQ and low motivation, as compared to a child with a lower IQ and high motivation, as you might imagine, that second child was much more successful. So while we all want our children to be very bright and intelligent, if they don't have the motivation to utilize those strengths, they'll be wasted. And so motivation is another key area that we're going to explore today as well. Finally, our fifth area is the home environment. And obviously, if there's a lot of chaos, arguing, stress, tension at home, well, that's going to impact everyone, including the student. Let's first talk a little bit about different kinds of learning challenges that students typically have. The first that I'd like to talk about is a language-based learning disability, and let me just preface by saying to precisely diagnose these issues, we usually benefit from using psychological testing and doing psychometric testing. But I'm going to give you a lot of strategies today that hopefully will help you to avoid that. It's wonderful to do psychological testing, but it's very time consuming and it can be very expensive Oftentimes when I do psychological testing on a student, the cost can be $2,000 to $3,000 because of all the time involved and the different battery of tests that we use, etc. So hopefully this webinar will help some of you not have to go through that more expensive step and figure some of these things out on your own. The language-based learning disability. A child with this kind of issue typically has difficulties with understanding and use of spoken and written language. Language-based learning disabilities are a common cause of students' academic struggles because weak language skills impede comprehension and communication, which are really the basis for most school activities. And they can impact skills such as listening, reasoning, speaking, reading, writing, and sometimes even math calculations. School learning is very heavily language-based. The teacher's talking, you're listening, you're responding to questions, etc. You're listening to other students in the classroom. And so if you do have a language-based learning disability, it's really going to create a tremendous amount of struggles academically. There are also many students who have what we call a nonverbal learning disability, and this is where their language skills are actually very strong, but their nonverbal, usually visual processing abilities are deficient. And this can create a lot of problems as well in terms of spatial and coordination problems, making things like printing and writing, learning mathematics, telling time, keeping one's place on the page very difficult. There can also be social issues that are tied in with children with nonverbal learning disabilities who are often inattentive and poorly organized because they have trouble integrating and interpreting incoming information. So socially, for example, many but not all of these students have challenges with nonverbal communication, visually processing that along with what someone's saying, and that can really trip them up in terms of social interaction. And so this is another area of potential concern as well. Another category that's fairly common, actually, when we do psychological evaluation is what we call slow processing speed. This is where the student, usually with visual motor tasks like handwriting, copying from the board, they can do these tasks, but it just takes them a lot longer, and this is really based on some neurological factors in terms of how fast they process typically visual, but it could also be auditory information. And they may need more time to complete tasks and assignments, to complete written work, and to perform basic math calculations, which usually timing is a factor there. So that could be an issue as well. Another area of difficulty is what we call visual graphomotor difficulties. That's just a fancy kind of term for handwriting when we're using visual processing. So copying from the board, for example, would be an example of that. Typically, these challenges negatively impact writing skills and can be a function of visual processing difficulties or fine motor control. So typically when we're doing testing, for example, and we find visual graphomotor difficulties, we might do some additional testing just to see if it's fine motor control or if it has more to do with visual processing. Another area that often can be a challenge for students, and this is often confused with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, are deficits in short-term visual and/or auditory memory. And that can impact all areas of learning. Sometimes the issue has to do with short-term memory. Sometimes it has to do with what we call working memory. The difference is short-term memory is where you would instantly respond to what you have heard or seen. Working memory requires you to kind of hold that information in your mind and utilize it, move it around a little bit. So for example, doing math problems, a lot of times we have to use working memory. If I gave you a series of numbers and asked you to repeat them right back to me, that would be short-term auditory memory. And if I gave you a series of numbers and asked you to tell me them backwards, that would be a combination of short-term auditory memory as well as working memory because you had to manipulate that in your mind. And then we do have issues around attention and impulsivity, like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And significant attention or impulsivity issues can profoundly impact school performance. The one trick with this is there are many reasons why children exhibit attention and/or impulsivity issues in the classroom, and that's why, in my opinion, ADHD is so overdiagnosed, as the very same symptoms of ADHD can be a function of any of the issues we've already talked about above, issues, the emotional factors like anxiety and depression, as well as other factors. And so this is another reason, if you suspect ADHD concerns with your child, unfortunately, it's expensive, the testing, but in my opinion, it's the best way to really clarify precisely whether that's what's going on. And you know, we want to be clear because, as many of you know, if your child's diagnosed with ADHD, often you know, stimulant medication is prescribed, and that's very serious psychotropic medication. It affects growth and other things in children developmentally. I can tell you from working with many students over the years, for some kids that are correctly diagnosed with ADHD and put on the right medication and dosage, it's a wonderful blessing for them. It's like a light switch goes on and their focus in school dramatically improves. So it's not a black or white issue, but again, we want to be very thoughtful about precisely what's going on before we jump into treatment. Finally, another area of concern potentially can be below average intelligence. Now, we use IQ testing quite often. We use the word intelligence quite often, but the truth is, on intelligence tests, they're kind of limited. In other words, intelligence tests don't measure creativity, for example, and I think we'd all agree that creativity is a part of intelligence. What the intelligence tests measure very well, however, is school achievement, because they look at a variety of different areas of processing: visual processing, auditory processing, processing speed, working memory, a lot of the areas we just talked about. And so it gives us a very clear picture. The overall IQ score is basically just averaging these different subtests that are included in the intellectual battery. Keep in mind that an IQ of 100 is exactly at the 50th percentile, meaning that 50% of the population is above 100, 50% of the population is below. And while we would all like to think that we, as well as our children, have IQs above 100, 50% of us do not. And you know, for a student with an IQ of 85, 90, they're going to look and talk, you know, very similar to sort of the average child. And so it can be tough to differentiate that without, you know, some precise testing. And while there's a lot more to intelligence than what those IQ tests measure, it's a very strong predictor of school success. So I've had the experience in the past, and it's challenging in terms of providing the family with this information, where for many years we thought that Johnny was doing poorly in school because he wasn't motivated enough, and we got into a lot of arguments about motivation. We tried a lot of things. It's been a big challenge. I tested a child a while ago, and he told me himself the reason he wasn't doing well in school was that he wasn't motivated, because that's what he had heard and that's what he came to believe. When we did the testing, we found out that unfortunately he had a lower IQ, which really explained everything. And it was a blessing in disguise, because it really helped the parents to kind of reorient themselves in terms of their approach to their son and an understanding of his strengths and weaknesses. And for him, you know, getting C's and a few B's was fantastic. And so it helped them to sort of adjust their expectations, which was very important. Let's talk a little bit about emotional factors that can affect learning. It's very important to assess and rule out underlying emotional issues, as they can often look like other things. For example, it's common to assume that a student that has ADHD, when actually there's underlying anxiety going on, as we've talked about before. Similarly, one of the symptoms of depression is concentration difficulties. That's why psychometric testing is helpful to verify an ADHD diagnosis. And we'll talk about some of the more common emotional issues here, but there are clearly many more that could also impact school performance. But in my experience, these are the ones that are most common. And I'm just going to kind of go over these briefly for you now. The two areas basically involve anxiety and depression. In terms of anxiety, there's a lot of different kinds of anxiety. For example, generalized anxiety, which involves excessive worry regarding multiple life issues or situations, and it can compromise our ability to function in school or at home. Social anxiety can often lead to a pattern of social avoidance, which can easily mushroom into not going to school and what we call school avoidance. And the longer school avoidance goes on, the tougher it is to reverse. I mean, this can often be a very challenging problem for the family, for the school, for the student themselves. Another very common anxiety issue is what we call performance anxiety. And this specifically relates to excessive worry about one's ability to perform specific tasks, like test anxiety, for example, in school. And so it's not uncommon to talk to a child with test anxiety who will tell you that they studied a lot for the exam, they knew everything, and somehow when they went into that test, they drew a blank and got very stressed out and underperformed on that test. And then we also have, lastly, separation anxiety. Now, this is more common for younger kids, preschool, kindergarten, where they have problems separating from mom or dad. And again, this can if it's left undealt with, this can actually turn into school avoidance and create a lot of challenges in terms of getting that student into school on a regular basis. So this is something else that can really dramatically impact school performance over time. Mood disorders are also very common, and you should know that in Colorado, where we are, depression is very high across the board, particularly for adolescents, but for children as well. You know, for example, whenever I meet and do an assessment with a child, regardless of the referral issues, I always look to rule out depression and to assess very carefully for depression before moving forward. And you know, in addition to the potential concentration difficulties that I mentioned earlier, which are a symptom of depression, depression can dramatically reduce one's energy level, ability to complete a multitude of life tasks, as the person typically loses interest in activities once enjoyed, like doing well in school. So depression in and of itself can dramatically impact school performance. And then another mood disorder, which unfortunately is very overdiagnosed now in children and adolescents, is bipolar disorder. And so in addition to the challenges noted for depression, with bipolar disorder there are typically behavioral difficulties related to impulsivity, irritability, which can further compromise one's ability to function in all areas of life, including school. And last but certainly not least is the issue of poor self-esteem. I'm of the opinion that we all have poor self-esteem to some degree. None of us like the way we look in a photograph. None of us like the way we sound on a recording. Hopefully I sound lovely today. But this is an area that can really challenge students, especially if they have any kind of learning challenge. Frankly, in my experience working with children in the schools, if they had any kind of significant learning disability, almost without exception, they had self-esteem issues because they would be in that class, maybe for many years, and notice that the student next to them is able to do all these different tasks well, and maybe don't even seem as bright as they are, and yet they can't do it. And so when we get this kind of sense of, I can't do something everyone else can do, of course it impacts our sense of self. And this is another reason why we really want to figure out what's going on and help that student so that we can address these issues as soon as possible to reduce the onset of reduced self-esteem. Let's talk a little bit about behavioral issues now. These are listed on your screen. Impulsivity certainly being one of them. Students with impulsivity issues often display undesirable classroom behaviors which can distract them from their academic task at hand, cause them to fall behind their class peers, may lead to disciplinary actions. Often they're a big distraction to their peers as well. And so this is something that we want to kind of assess and take a look at. It could be a function of, again, many different things, including ADHD, but that is simply one of many, many reasons why we might see that impulsivity. Similarly, see inattention, where the student's attention issues are a problem for them. And you know, typically the child who is impulsive is identified very early in school because frankly they're a pain in the neck, and it's really obvious that they're being disruptive, they're not learning, etc. A lot of times inattentive students, if they're behaving well, you know, they're not as obvious and they can be missed, especially if they're very well behaved, etc. But are similarly distracted academically, losing focus in the classroom, falling behind academically. And again, this can be an ADHD symptom, or as we've mentioned, it can be a symptom of many other things as well. Some students struggle with organizational skills in the classroom. This becomes increasingly important as a student moves up in school, from elementary to middle to high school to college, etc., and can have a major negative impact on grades and day-to-day functioning. And so we want to look at that as well. Socializing can be a challenge, as many of you know, with your social students and children. For some students, excessive socializing in class can really impact their focus and performance, as well as result in disciplinary consequences. Sometimes, again, this is a combination of impulsivity and socialization. Last but certainly not least, oppositional defiance. And this is really a category for children and adolescents who have, you know, a real reluctance to conform to the requests of authority figures, and that can be parents, it could also be teachers in school. Clearly, if we have that going on, that can be a dramatic negative factor in terms of their school performance. Let's talk for a moment about achievement motivation. Achievement motivation is key. As I mentioned before, you can be the brightest student in the world, and if you're not motivated, you're not going to do well in school. And so this is something that we really want to assess and really consider. And this is true not just in school, but in life. A poorly motivated student will falter regardless of their intelligence. And so we really want to be focused on this. And in a little while, we'll talk about some motivational strategies that we can use at home. The other thing that I want you to understand is the concept of self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is one's belief that they can accomplish a task or reach a goal. In other words, self-efficacy is a personal belief about one's ability to succeed in a particular situation. So for example, my self-efficacy of doing the work as a psychologist is strong because I've been doing it for so long. I have confidence that I can do it well. My self-efficacy about skiing is very low because I don't ski, even though I live in Colorado, and when I talk to people that don't live in Colorado, they get very angry at me that I don't ski, but I don't. And so my self-efficacy for skiing, of course, would be much lower. And that has a big impact because I will go into a ski situation anxious, lacking confidence, and chances are that's going to only fuel more problems in terms of that skill. Whereas if I'm working as a psychologist in an area that I have experience in and feel confident, have high self-efficacy, that's going to really help me to accomplish the task at hand in a much better fashion. I also want you to know that I am not seeing too many questions yet on the chat box, which is fine. But if you do have questions, feel free to ask them, and I'm going to do my best to answer those as best as I can. Let's talk next about the home environment. And you know, interestingly enough, I got an email from a parent recently who was discussing the fact that when she went to a number of professionals regarding school issues with her child, she was surprised how few asked her about how the marriage was, how the family interactions were. And she is absolutely right, because this is a very important category that we need to assess and make sure that it's not contributing to the challenges that we see in school. So for example, to give you the sort of extreme example of a high conflict family, perhaps moving towards divorce, that's going to impact everybody's functioning in the family, not just the student, but everyone. And as you can imagine, and if you've had the unfortunate experience of being in a situation like that, or are currently in a situation like that, you certainly understand how those issues can compromise your functioning in terms of your responsibilities at work or at home, let alone a child's who feels a lot less control over those issues, a lot less understanding as well. So family function is really important in terms of behavior, in terms of emotional factors. And for most children, having a structured routine can really enhance the odds that they will complete their daily responsibilities in a reasonable time frame. Believe it or not, most kids really like and want structure. They may not realize it, but it's true. And as parents, there's a lot we can do in that regard. We'll talk more about that in a bit as well. The other area that is, I think it affects some people more than others is nutritional considerations. Certainly poor nutrition can have a significant effect on daily functioning, emotion, behavior. And so this is another area that we just want to be aware of. And believe it or not, if routine, nutrition, these other areas that we're talking about on this slide are dramatically impacted, we could see a lot of problems in school just based on these kind of issues alone. So we certainly want to pay attention to them. Another category that's very important is sleep. We know that getting enough sleep is critically important for healthy daily functioning. And it's a particular challenge for adolescents. Those of you that know me over the years know that this is a very big area of concern for me in terms of when we start school, particularly for high school students. Despite the fact that sleep research has shown us consistently that adolescents need typically about 9.5 hours of sleep at night, we start school too early. And as you may or may not know, for adolescents, they really cannot get to sleep on average until 11 o'clock at night, sometimes later. So if you do the math, they're getting to bed at 11:30 or midnight. They have to be in school at 7:30 or 8 o'clock. There's just not enough time. And that's why I always feel bad for teachers that have first period classes, because they will all tell you in high school that there are kids that are sleeping in their class, and that must feel very frustrating for them. And so we really, really want to be thinking about that. And I would love for each of you to write to your superintendent at your school district and tell them how important making late start is at the high school level, because it's totally a function, ladies and gentlemen, of us. It's not the school's fault. It's parents that drive that decision. And if the majority of parents spoke loudly to their schools about moving that time later, at least 8:30 is the rule of thumb, and in my opinion it should be later than 8:30, we would see dramatic improvements in terms of our children's functioning, not just at school, but in all areas. We've seen this through research, that when we get enough sleep, it improves everything in terms of emotions, behavior, academic success, etc. So it's an important category. Finally, I put down electronic media as well, because too many electronic distractions can impact time on important tasks as well as getting enough sleep. The truth is, even though I think it would be tough for most families to do if their kids are used to having all that technology in their room, but it's really a good idea to remove all technology, particularly those smartphones, because you'd be amazed at how often your child is up late at night texting with their friends, or they're asleep and then they hear their phone and it's 2 in the morning. Obviously going to be very disruptive for them. So to come up with some structure and routine around that as well, in terms of when it's okay to use media, when it's not, whether or not it's in one's room, etc., is a conversation that's probably well worth having, especially as your children get older. Now let's talk about this idea of a skills analysis. Basically, the way the skill analysis works is, now that we understand that we have these 5 main areas that we've been discussing, we want to kind of assess each one to determine if our child has weaknesses in one or more of these categories. Once we complete our skills analysis, we can try to strengthen those areas of weakness and evaluate their impact on school performance. To get a sense of possible learning weaknesses, parents may want to carefully review their child's school records, for example. This is something I always do when I do psychological testing. I ask for every single piece of schoolwork that I can get my hands on, every single report card going back to pre-K, and I look and study those carefully because they tell a story about that child's learning. And so this is something that any parent can do as well, and it'll start giving you a sense of where the areas of concern are, whether they're in terms of learning or behavior in the classroom, etc. This is very important data that we want in terms of doing our skills analysis. We also want to look at the standardized testing that's been given, as well as report cards, any other assessments that were done, either in school or privately. We want to look at all that information. This will also help in terms of the behavioral issues, as these are often noted by the classroom teacher in terms of the report card. And so I list those 5 categories that we talked about, and we want to just start identifying strengths and weaknesses in each of those areas. You want to be your own social scientist. Again, these are the areas that I look at and study in great detail when I do psychological testing, but my hope is that many of you will be able to utilize this strategy that we're talking about today to spare you the time and expense required for extensive psychological testing. So we've done our skills analysis, and then we can more effectively target the issues that require intervention across our 5 categories. And now what we're going to do is we're going to kind of talk a little bit more about each of those categories and what we might be able to do in terms of intervention. I'm just going to look briefly at the chat box. I see you guys have been chatting about school start. Yeah, can you believe that Silver Creek starts at 7:15? That is just wrong. It's just wrong. And we really, as a community, we need to stand up and do something about it. Let's start with this issue of learning challenges and what we can do to address it if we find, boy, I really have a sense that my child may have a visual, auditory, learning processing speed, etc. issue. What can we do about that? Well, one of the things that we might want to do is further academic and learning assessment. If we suspect areas of academic weakness, it's really helpful to have more in-depth individual assessment. And this is something that your child's school may be willing to do, or something, of course, that you can do privately as well. Once completed, we'll have a much better sense of the student's precise skill acquisition in these key academic areas like reading, writing, and math. In other words, if we do individual achievement or academic testing, and we find that the child really is pretty solid in all those areas, yet underperforming, let's say, in written expression, well, that gives us insight that maybe it's more of a motivational factor, that it's not because of some learning difficulty. Whereas if we do the individual testing and we find that our child has average or above skills in every area except for, let's say, reading, and reading is very low, well, that's going to affect a lot of academic areas, and now we have a very important clue as to what we might want to focus on and help our child strengthen. And that brings us to our next bullet of additional academic support. So obviously, if we find that our child has weakness in a certain academic area as a function of our analysis, we would then want to provide them with some academic support. And again, this is something that sometimes a school can do. Sometimes it's something that we opt to do privately. You know, there's a lot of programs in the community, like Dreamcatchers, direct instruction centers, where they provide educational support. I'm plugging them because they're part of my group. I apologize. But they do excellent work, if I may say so. Now, there's a lot of things that can go on in the school district in terms of helping your son or daughter. Typically, when schools find that there's some real significant issues with learning, there's a group of folks that meet at the school to discuss these students and figure out what they can do to really help these students to improve academically. And they may develop what's called an ILP, or individual learning plan. Now, this is not special ed. This is really a kind of a first step in a long sequence of possible steps that the school district can do. And the other thing you should realize when we're talking about this ILP, when we're talking about a 504 plan, when we're talking about special education, is that this applies to any school, public or private, that accepts federal funding. So all public schools, for example, have all of these structures in place, but many private schools do not. And so if your child is in a private school, you know, it's very important to be talking to the school professionals, find out what resources they have, etc. Each school is a little bit different in terms of how many support services they can provide. Another possibility, which again is a little bit more of a higher level of service, if you will, is called a 504 plan. And this is usually done after an ILP has been created, and yet it doesn't get the job done. There's still problems with learning. And so what a 504 plan allows, and this is part of actually federal education law, it's part of the Federal Disabilities Act, the same legislation that requires wheelchair access to buildings, believe it or not, also says that if you have any kind of physical learning or emotional challenge that interferes with your skill acquisition in school, that there needs to be a review, and a 504 plan may be developed for that student. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, it's pretty common to find that students have slow processing speed, which really can create problems in school. And so when we do testing and we find slow processing speed, we always recommend that that student get extended time on tests, on homework, etc. Often we recommend reduced homework as well. And just as a little aside about homework, we give too much homework. I don't know why we do that. Maybe it's just because that's what we've always done. It's shocking when you know the research about homework. So for example, in elementary school, believe it or not, there is a zero correlation between homework and achievement. Zero. Yet we start giving homework at kindergarten. And you know, those of you that have school-age kids know that this is one of the most common reasons that we get into fights at home, and that it fuels that family dysfunction that we talked about before. Getting your kid to do their homework, fighting about them getting it done, etc., etc. And so this is another area that I'm hoping that we can assert ourselves with our schools and let them know that we'd really like to see a reduction in the amount of homework given to our students. Just so you know, research shows that in middle school, anything over an hour doesn't correlate with intelligence, and in high school, it's an hour and a half. And unfortunately, most of our students are doing a lot more homework than that. So something to really think about in terms of that. But there's a lot of different, they're called accommodations that can be written into the 504 plan. And again, it depends on what we find in terms of that learning assessment, where the areas of weakness are, where the student needs help, etc. So for example, let's say the student has tremendous visual processing problems, but their auditory processing is good. So in other words, they will understand the teacher's lecture, but they might not understand what the teacher writes on the board. It's great if that teacher could explain some of the board stuff using verbal strategies and talking to that student about it. That's something else that we can put on a 504. And again, the 504 is a function of those areas of weakness that we've determined through some kind of assessment. Let's move on to when to consider special ed. If a student demonstrates significantly below average academic deficits based upon individual testing and a 504 plan is insufficient, there's a wide range of special education services that we might want to provide to that student. And there's a real range of this. If you're in a public school setting and you have any questions about this, you definitely should talk to the school. There are folks there that have tremendous expertise regarding the process around special education. And special education law has changed over the years. Currently, the view typically focuses on very low academic scores. So if we do academic testing with a student and they are, I think in the Boulder Valley School District, for example, I think they have to be at or below the 15th percentile in terms of academic functioning in that area. And that's not a, a black and white rule, but I've heard that referred to when I've gone to meetings at different schools. Then we would want to consider special education services. Unlike a 504 plan, in addition to accommodations, with special education we can also do what are called modifications, where we can change some of the structure in terms of the courses and what the student has to take, and maybe offer them some additional services in the school, etc. So this is something to consider. Now, special education is a double-edged sword. In my opinion, there's always some stigma typically involved with kids that are involved with special education, although we've done better over the years. Typically now, if a child gets special education support, one of the strategies, for example, to reduce stigma is that special education teacher will go into that classroom, work with several kids, including the special ed kids, so that they don't feel as stigmatized as compared to having to go out to a special class that their other friends are going to ask them, "Where are you going, Johnny?" And it can create issues. Regardless of the special education service, however, it's very clear that as kids get older, they get more sensitive to this sort of special treatment and often do not want to continue with special education services. So the rule of thumb really is to get it going as early as possible. One of the questions that I see was asked is about in what grade or age can you start evaluating these learning processes. And really I like to start at around 6 years of age. And the truth is you want to do this early on. As soon as you start noticing concerns, I would suggest not going to the place of maybe my child will grow out of it and waiting till they're in 4th, 5th, 6th grade before you move forward, because the window of opportunity is closing. My experience working in the schools is such that when we identify significant learning issues early on, and when early on I mean early elementary, we're able to address them in a much more effective way through remediating those issues. So let's say the child has poor handwriting, and we find this out in kindergarten, 1st grade. We might be able to provide them with occupational therapy, other services to really help them improve their writing skills. If we wait till 5th, 6th grade or later, it's much more difficult and the window is kind of closed, and then we go to modification versus remediation. So for example, if the child has weak handwriting, at that point I might be less apt to look at occupational therapy and more apt to suggest that they learn keyboarding moving forward, as an example. Let's talk now about strategies to address emotional factors. I'm just going to look at the questions for a moment here. We're going to get to those motivational issues soon. Beth, I appreciate you asking because you're on track, girl. We're going to be talking about that soon. And my thought on developing executive skills. There's a lot of programs coming out now, and you're correct. Dreamcatchers has a program, a new program that they just put together to help with executive functioning. I know that the psychiatrist in our group, Dr. Lee Johnston, also does some work around helping with developing executive functioning, and we are seeing some benefit in terms of tasks that we can have students do that helps them with their memory, with their focus, etc. But like a lot of things, it works better for some people than others. But if you have a child that has significant executive functioning skills, and that usually means things like the ADHD symptoms of attention, concentration, impulsivity, planning, organizational skills, those are kind of things all fall under the rubric of executive functioning, then it's something that you might want to consider. First assessing clearly and then providing some help because it would be lovely if medication was an option, not a requirement, in terms of addressing those issues. Let's talk now about strategies to address emotional factors. The first thing might seem simplistic, this idea of increasing opportunities for ongoing communication. It may sound trivial, but I have to tell you it's far from that. Studies consistently show that families who communicate often about at-risk behaviors, for example, have much lower rates of at-risk behavior. Even though your child may be rolling their eyes or saying, "Oh, Dad, you already told me that," we need to have these ongoing conversations with our kids. Very important. I mean, it's ideal to check in as a family about our day-to-day experiences and emotional lives, providing all family members with a healthy outlet to deal with and process difficult feelings. Otherwise, negative feelings may remain under the surface and develop into more significant psychological disorders. For example, I've never met anyone, and this is unusual for me to say, but it's true, I've never met anyone that was struggling with anger management problems, and that is boys, girls, men, women, who didn't have issues with being assertive. And what I mean by that is typically folks with anger issues are terrible at expressing their feelings, especially negative feelings. And so they don't express them, they sweep them under the rug gets bumpy, and eventually it's like a pressure cooker building up steam. And eventually those negative feelings all come out at once. Usually it's a situation that's not that bad, but this day that kid is over the top. Everyone's wondering why they're overreacting so much. It's because those negative feelings have been building up for so long, they have to come out. And so they come out in the worst way. We want to help that student or adult learn to express those feelings earlier on and deal with them. Simply expressing them is half the battle. And so if we can increase our opportunities for ongoing communication at home, this will help everyone's emotional functioning. So it's great at the dinner table, for example, to just talk about our day and what made us feel happy, what made us feel sad, what made us feel frustrated, and to all share, for us to model as adults and to really listen to those children in our family as well. It's not a conversation that we may have as often as we should. And so let's see what we can do to improve that in terms of our ongoing communication. And of course, we all tend to communicate negatively at home. If you were to record your day-to-day interactions with your child, you would be disappointed to see that the majority of your conversation with your child involves things like, "Stop doing that, don't hit your brother, how many times have I told you?" That's my favorite. How many times have I told you? I don't think you want your child to answer that question. But the point being, we all tend to focus on the negative. It's human nature. And so anything we can do to kind of shift that, communicate more at home, and try to communicate positively too. The idea of catching your child being good is so wonderful in that regard, because it kind of reminds us to focus on something positive that our child is doing versus something negative. And this can really help in terms of school motivation as well, which we'll talk about in a moment. The other thing, of course, we could always do is psychological assessment to determine if counseling is necessary. In some cases, we do want to get some individual, family, and/or group counseling going. And think about this. When we have concerns about our child's physical health, we go to a doctor, right? A medical doctor, to have it evaluated, to find out if they need medication or what we need to do to help them. We should have the same approach to emotional mental health issues as well. And our child may or may not need counseling, but our child may or may not need medication, but we still go to the doctor to find out. So it's a really good idea to do this kind of initial assessment with a mental health professional to determine if these are areas that we need to be concerned about or not. Does it warrant the level of counseling or not? A good initial assessment can really help. When I do this, it takes about an hour and a half to 2 hours, and we have great clarity about what's going on. And I would suggest that it's, worth that investment as compared to perhaps weeks and months of counseling that may or may not be necessary. It may or may not be the right therapist, may or may not be the right kind of counseling. But all of those questions can be answered in a very effective way if we've done an initial assessment and gotten to know that student, that child, and what kind of counseling and what kind of therapist and what kind of approach might be best. Now let's talk about the issue that Beth brought up earlier about motivational issues and what we can do and some strategies for parents in terms of addressing. I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead. We're talking first about behavioral issues. And this does actually dovetail into motivation, as you'll see. One of the things that we might want to consider in terms of motivational and behavioral issues is implementation of a behavioral incentive plan. Now, I can tell you that when I talk about this with parents, there's some resistance sometimes. A lot of parents feel like, well, I'm not going to bribe my child to do what they're supposed to do. that comes up a lot, etc. But what I would suggest that you consider in all this is that my view of developing these behavioral incentive plans is not to, you know, every time your child does something right, they get a reward. That's really not what I'm talking about at all. What I'm talking about is helping them to develop skills that are now weak, that we want to be strong. And so let's say, just as an example, the behavioral incentive plan has to do about the discipline of coming home and after having a snack, getting right to doing your homework. This ties into the routine issue, which we're going to talk about in a moment. The idea of providing a behavioral incentive plan means that we do something to reinforce that student's motivation, because clearly that student's not motivated to get right to work when they get home, because that's been a problem for us. And so we create some incentive, and I'll talk more about the kind of incentives that I would suggest you use. And we create that incentive, and if it's motivating to our child, guess what? They're going to start getting their homework started right away because they want to get that reinforcement, whatever that may be. And the idea of the plan is to help them to develop the skills, practicing. As you all know, there's magic to practice effect. Think about the first time you were learning to drive and you went on the highway for the first time and it was so overwhelming, and then with practice you would pass your exit and be on autopilot. That's a great example of the practice effect with learning. The same is true of kids learning to write their name. That's a very complex task. But with practice, we can do it without thinking about it. And so we want our kids to develop those skills as well, in the example given around getting started with their homework after a little snack at home. And so by using that incentive, it gets them into that habit, helps them to see that, wow, less arguments at home, I don't have to deal with my homework, you know, at 8:30 at night. And so the hope is, with a little bit of incentive at the beginning, they'll start to practice that skill, strengthen that skill, and then it's very important to remove that incentive. And I can tell you that the incentive that works best, in my opinion, is not things, is not money, is not toys, is not candy, but believe it or not, it's your time and attention. Because that's what your child wants, especially younger children, and believe it or not, even adolescents. And that's a topic for another webinar. But I can tell you that I have a book on our website that talks about strategies to utilize this approach. If you went to our website, boulderpsychologicalservices.com, and you go to Counseling for Children, you'll see in the upper right corner there's a free book that you can download that will talk about this in much more detail. So I'll leave that alone at this point. The other thing that we want to do if our kids have organizational issues is help them with that in terms of tools. The most common, the idea of a daily planner. And again, we might have to use some incentives to get our kid into the habit of practicing using that planner, but they will certainly discover, as many of us have in life, that once we develop that skill, it serves us well. We remember very easily to do it at the end of every class, and it really helps us to keep things together in school. And what a great training tool for that student when they're in college, because guess what? That's not going to change. It's only going to get more complicated. And so if you have organizational skills as a younger student, you're going to be in trouble when you're on your own in college. And then, you know, if we try all these strategies and we're still seeing challenges with behavioral issues, we might want to consider an additional evaluation by a licensed mental health professional to determine etiology, to determine the cause of these factors. We've arrived at motivation. Let's talk about that briefly for a little while. One of the things that we want to really get good at as parents is what I would phrase as targeted positive feedback, focusing on effort. This strategy will serve to increase your child's academic self-efficacy, as well as positively impacting their self-esteem. It's important to focus more on the child's efforts than the results. This is something we know through very recent research. And you might have seen some articles about, you know, how we praise our kids too much and it's bad. And I really take exception to that, because it's the way we praise them, it's how we praise them. And, you know, seeing a child who maybe struggles on getting their homework done, and they went up to their room and they worked on it and they got it done, we don't want to just say, good job, you know, great job on your homework. We want to say, you know, I noticed that you went up there, you kept putting effort into it. I bet you were bored or tired, but you kept working at it despite that. You know, you want to get to the sort of skills, not so much to the outcome. That's why, for example, you know, a child takes an exam at school, we want to focus on how much effort they put into studying for that exam and completing that exam. That's much more important than the grade. And some kids could get an A on a test and not put any effort into it. And that's really kind of a mixed blessing for that student, because they're not going to develop that self-efficacy in terms of more difficult tests as they move forward. what happens when kids do that is it usually works out great in elementary school, but then when they hit middle school, let alone high school, those strategies don't work anymore. They don't have study skills, and they run into big problems. And so we really want to consider, again, using things like the behavioral incentive techniques that we talked about to get those habits going. And then again, to remove them once we have a good couple of weeks of demonstration of acquiring that skill that was practiced. The other thing that we want to think about are what's called natural consequences. So for example, instead of fighting with your child to complete homework, it's much more effective to let the child fail at completing homework and allow the natural consequences that the classroom teacher has to occur. And I usually suggest this shift in terms of homework around 5th grade, that it's their homework, not your homework. And it shouldn't be this source of conflict constantly at home. And I would just talk to the teacher about it, get the teacher's advice about it. They have consequences at school. And instead of sort of saving your child, right, and we do this a lot, where our child's not doing their homework and we're like looking over their shoulder for 5 hours to get the homework done, the teacher may not even realize that all that's going on at home. We really want to focus more on the natural consequences and, say to your child, well, this is your responsibility. If you don't do it, I guess you're not going to get a good grade in that class. And, it's important to make that shift because, think about it. As your child gets older, they have to take self-satisfaction. Unless you're ready to live with them in the dorm at college, they have to learn to be self-sufficient academically. And one way to do that is to let them feel the sting of not doing what's required now when they're maybe in elementary school as compared to high school where it's going to affect getting into college, et cetera, et cetera. So natural consequences are our friend, and we want to let them play out. We don't want to sort of rescue our child from those natural consequences. I'm just going to digress to some of the questions that you guys have asked for a moment, and then we'll go back to the home environment. I know that we're running short on time, so I want to respect some of the questions that have been asked. Roberta asked about cognitive counseling, if it's appropriate for a 10-year-old. It definitely is. Kind of depends on the child. I mean, when I meet with children and do an assessment, I'm very proud of the group of therapists that associate with me at Boulder Psychological Services because we have cognitive therapists, we have art therapists, we have equine therapists who do work with horses. I mean, to me, the counseling approach should be individually tailored for that child or adult. But as long as the child has good language functioning, cognitive counseling can be very effective. Generally speaking, for younger children, I would say 8 and below. Play therapy is much more of a sort of a standard to go to. But I've certainly worked with kids that were young that were sort of very verbal and intellectual, and they actually did well with cognitive counseling. And as you may know, cognitive behavioral counseling can be super effective in terms of things like depression and anxiety. I'm trying to read some of your questions here. Help in terms of intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation. That's where I like to use the extrinsic motivators to develop the intrinsic. In other words, if you use external motivators for your child to get their homework done, to study better for tests, and then they go into that classroom and they take that test, they get a good grade, and they see how great that feels. That's the whole idea of the incentive program that I was describing. Yeah, let's give them a little running start with some external motivators, but hopefully their own intrinsic motivation will then sprout from that because they've experienced the positive consequences of engaging in practicing that behavior. So to me, they're really tied together. Let's move on now to strategies to address the home environment. I'm going to try to read that one that is kind of long, that question, but it'll take me too much time right now, but I'm going to try to look at that before we're done. Strategies to address the home environment. Now, I don't know about your house, but speaking personally, I think all families are a little dysfunctional from now and then, maybe more than now and then. I wish I could practice as well as I preach, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of parenting. I can tell you all day long what you're supposed to do, but maybe I get a needs improvement as well. Luckily, my daughter has not, as far as I know, gotten onto the chat box, luckily for me. But we want to enhance family function and well-being. Now, obviously, this would be great for all of us. We all benefit from that, enhancing that family functioning. And so that's something that we all could benefit from. And this is something you really want to take a good look at. We need to do what's necessary to maintain a warm, nurturing environment at home as best we can. And so we really want to kind of do a little self-evaluation. Just like we were talking about doing an analysis of our kid in school, we want to do a little family analysis too and see how all that's going and what we can do to improve that. Because it's very important. It's a very important factor in terms of school functioning. We want to develop regular academic routines, as we've talked about. We want to foster good nutritional habits. And we really want to improve sleep patterns by monitoring electronic media and revolting against the school districts across the country to start those kids a little later in school. It's something that we really, really want to think about. So, a thoughtful analysis with appropriate follow-up will greatly increase the odds of your school success for your child. There's your child. Look, she graduated college. Aren't we proud? You have additional questions or concerns. I know I didn't get to all the questions. I'm going to try to answer a few before I close out this webinar. But if you have additional questions for me, I'm happy to chat with you about it, email or phone. If you'd like to email me directly, you can do so at info@boulderpsychologicalservices.com. And I'm just going to take a look at that longer question. I hope you received the first part of my message. School district refused to help, decided she was fine. There was memory processing, visual auditory testing recommended. She started 5th grade, behind, not motivated to do anything. I'm afraid when she goes to middle school, she'll give up altogether. Then she mentions that there was some testing done, and she's in 5th grade. She's failing some there. She seems depressed. I feel like I've been turned away every opportunity to get help and no success. A few suggestions, and then she mentions as well, or he, I need to get someone to respond seriously to this. Her struggles with sensory integration are so obvious to me. One of the things that you can consider is what's called a school advocate. And there are many professionals that do this, where they will go into the school and advocate for your child, and they usually have tremendous knowledge and expertise about federal education law, etc. And sometimes that's necessary, unfortunately, just to make sure that the school's doing what's required of them by law. And again, I don't know what kind of testing was done by who and how, how good a job they did, but typically when we do psychological testing, or psychoeducational testing as it's sometimes referred to, it's very clear and precise in terms of the areas of deficit, the specific recommendations that we think the school should do, and then the burden is on the school to say why they shouldn't do it. So without knowing more about your situation, I'm going to just leave it at that for now. And I feel like I addressed all the questions. Let me just take a little look here. If you have another one, now is the time. Jenny agreed about way too much homework. We're on the same page, girl, that's for sure. We talked about what grade to eventually do that. I think I'm caught up. All right then. Not seeing any more questions. I really hope this was helpful. And just so you know, we're going to be doing webinars every month this school year. So I'd really encourage you to get on our newsletter. I send an email newsletter every month. Next month, we're going to be doing a very important talk about depression. We're doing it in partnership with the Hope Coalition of Boulder County. Wonderful group. You can find out more about the Hope Coalition of Boulder County online. Tremendous amount of useful information from those folks. Another great group to know about is Coley's Closet. You could look that up online, Coley's Closet. They do a lot of great work, peer support around depression and suicide prevention. In November, we're going to be doing a webinar on social media, sexting, and gaming with Ryan Dawson. And then in December, the secrets to effective family communication with Jeremy Dion. I hope this talk was useful, and I'm looking forward to talking to you next time. I have a final question. What about dealing with basic personality traits that cause motivation issues, perfectionism, etc.? When they're significant, oftentimes counseling is a wonderful adjunct to help people with that. And it's a mixed blessing, right? So for example, perfectionism. I tend to be perfectionistic. Look how perfect my slides were. I mean, please. But it's a mixed blessing. In other words, I try really hard to do a great job, but because I'm perfectionistic, I always give myself a needs improvement. So, we want to look at those things. But when it's severe, I assessed a kid recently that was very perfectionistic, and this child was totally avoidant. She had learning disabilities. She was perfectionistic. That's a tough combination, and she shifted just to a tremendous amount of avoidance. So again, in terms of personality traits, really good to understand them clearly. Testing is but one way to do it, but I'm a psychologist. That's my world. We have a lot of very effective techniques that we can use to really understand a person's emotional life and how they view things. And then when we have a clear picture, just like we talked about with the skills analysis here, we can then build, hopefully, very effective interventions. Thanks so much to those of you that have paid attention during all this time. I hope it was useful. I will be sending you all an email with the replay URL. Thanks for your time today. Good luck with those lovely children of yours and having them be successful in school. Thank you.